All right, well, welcome on behalf of the Brewer Foundation and New York University. Welcome to the 24th Annual International Public Policy Forum Semifinals. My name is Andrea Sadberry. I'm the IPPF Executive Director. Since its founding in 2001, the IPPF has stood alone as the only global debate competition empowering high school students to engage in both written and oral debates on pressing public policy issues. This year, 283 teams from 26 countries and 30 US states tackled the topic resolved. Equitable access to pharmaceuticals should be prioritized over protecting intellectual property rights. After rigorous review, the top 64 teams advanced into a months-long written debate tournament, exchanging arguments via email in a test of logic, research, and resilience. Now, the 8 teams that emerged victorious from that global exchange have gathered in New York City as guests of the Brewer Foundation. The quarterfinal competitions were held just moments ago, and this time we'll begin the first semifinal debate with DuPont Manual High School of Louisville, Kentucky, competing against Westwood High School of Austin, Texas. At this time, I'd like to invite the debaters to please introduce themselves.
I'm Victoria Fu from DuPont Manual, and I'm a senior in high school.
I'm Alia Jha from DuPont Manual High School as well, and I'm a junior in high school.
I'm Srishti Guru. I'm a sophomore, and I'm from Westwood High School.
Hi, I'm Sanvi Mithil, and I'm a sophomore from Westwood High School.
I'm Cheyenne Amredi, and I'm a sophomore from Westwood High School.
Let's give these debaters a big round of applause. Now to introduce our moderators and our judges for this round. Serving as our moderator is Mr. David Baker. Mr. Baker is Director of Admissions and Financial Aid for St. Mark's School of Texas. Prior to taking this position, he spent 16 years teaching public speaking at the school and serving as coach of the St. Mark's debate team. Mr. Baker is a member of the IPPF Advisory Board. Our semifinal judges include Ms. Svetlana Eisenberg. Ms. Eisenberg is a partner at Brewer Attorneys and Counselors. A skilled trial lawyer, she is known for arguing high-profile court cases and handling complex investigations. Before joining Brewer, Ms. Eisenberg served as an assistant United States attorney in the District of New Jersey. Her earlier career as Associate General Counsel in HSBC's Global Internal Investigations Group gave her an inside view of managing large-scale internal investigations. Thank you for being here. Also, Dr. Andrew Garbarino. He serves as a visiting lecturer in biblical studies at Houston Christian University and Houston Theological Seminary. He holds a PhD in Hebrew Bible from Princeton Theological Seminary. Dr. Garbarino is also an ordained minister in the Reformed Church of America. A member of the 2008 and 2009 championship teams from Bel Air High School, he now serves as an active member of the IPPF Circle of Champions, mentoring teams and evaluating both written and oral debates. And our final judge, Mr. Noel Salesi, is the Director of Mission Advancement for Mary Noel Fathers and Brothers, the Catholic Foreign Mission Society of America. Prior to this position, he served as the Director of Development at CareLink International. Mr. Salesi helped found the International Debate Education Association and, for many years, directed the Open Society Foundation's Network Debate Program. He has helped establish debate programs in over 40 countries and has coached debate at Hunter College High School for over 35 years. Mr. Salesi is also a member of the IPPF Advisory Board. Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for our judges and moderator. Now, a quick reminder for everyone to please silence your cell phones, and with that, I will turn things over to Mr. Baker.
My first trip abroad for Soros was to Latvia.
Good morning, everybody. We will get right to it. We will start with opening statements by both teams. The first will be an 8-minute speech by the affirmative. You may begin when you are ready.
Okay. Wait, let me just pull up my... Hello? Okay. Access to life-saving medication is a basic human right, yet intellectual property rights deprive billions of people of that right, resulting in unnecessary casualties and exacerbating existing global inequalities. The World Health Organization reports that approximately 4.5 billion people do not have access to basic crucial healthcare, with high drug prices being key. Statistics demonstrating widespread socioeconomic disparities caused by IPR emphasize the urgent need to reconsider IP protections for life-saving drugs. Solutions prioritizing equitable access additionally have independent benefits, including faster pharmaceutical innovation and production. Thus, we proudly affirm. The term prioritized in the context of the resolution does not call for the complete elimination of IPR in the pharmaceutical industry. Instead, it declares that in situations where a direct conflict exists between maintaining IPR and ensuring equitable access to essential medicine, the latter must take precedence. First, let's talk about global economic disparities. Today's pharmaceutical industry structures bronze global economic disparities within LMICs, where high drug prices stretch limited healthcare budgets. These developments breach the 2001 Doha Declaration on the TRIPS Agreement, which confirmed that IPR should not interfere with public health efforts. Firstly, patent monopolies allow pharmaceutical companies to charge exorbitant prices, rendering treatments unaffordable for many LMICs. Doctor Without Borders corroborates that within 3 years, countries were able to buy an additional 450,000 courses of medications after Johnson & Johnson slashed Bedequin prices by 50% after the government successfully stopped the company from evergreening, leading to a $26 million in saving. Despite such rare reduction, this is not applicable across the status quo. High prices thus force LMICs to divert significant investments away from critical areas like infrastructures. Evergreening, a practice where companies make minor changes to existing drugs to secure patents, further extends these monopolies. Additionally, companies create patent thickets, layers of overlapping patents on a singular drug. Combined, these processes prevent local manufacturers and LMICs from producing affordable alternatives. By addressing IP restriction, LMICs should save significant amount of money that would previously be spent on drug costs, allowing reinvestment into healthcare systems and critical infrastructure. A healthier workforce boosts productivity and drives economic growth beyond healthcare. For instance, India's rise as a generic drug production leader has led to significant GDP growth. This growth is capable of diminishing these economic disparities that push millions into poverty and hinder development. Prioritizing affordable medicine would enable LMICs to allocate more resources to long-term economic development, combating entrenched global development imbalances. Second, on global health crises. Strict IPR for pharmaceutical drugs creates barriers and fosters a competitive environment, reducing cooperation among nations. However, prioritizing equitable access and reducing IPR can benefit society in two ways. First is increased scientific cooperation. The implementation of restrictive IPR in the pharmaceutical industry creates significant data sharing barriers across nations. Currently, researchers remain unwilling to share research because they consider their data proprietary and hold leverage over others. This lack of collaboration heavily impacts researchers and drug developers in LMICs, those already lacking the resources for early stage research. For example, Ethiopia faces challenges in technical knowledge and resources despite its progress in the industry. The country has no active ingredients, limiting prospects to secondary manufacturing. Researchers find that clinical trials and drug developments already have barriers in LMIC, such as limited infrastructure and funding. A decline in collaboration would only harm countries like Ethiopia, further disabling their ability to research niche drugs. Lack of international cooperation will continue to exacerbate inequalities regarding both access and pharmaceutical production in LMICs. In turn, the detrimental repercussions of reduced scientific cooperations become clear. It decelerates the rate of scientific advancement and excludes LMICs. Although global powerhouses will continue to develop pharmaceuticals, the field of research will reap far fewer benefits with fewer countries involved. While the pharmaceutical industry's current closed model hinders cooperation, a more collaborative problem-solving model has proved historically effective in other sectors. For example, the open source movement fosters significant technological advancements within just a few years. It highlighted a collaborative approach to software development, emphasizing community-driven innovation that emerged as a response to proprietary software models. When viewing this example through the lens of the pharmaceutical industry, reducing IPR could accelerate drug development, allowing researchers to build upon existing knowledge without the restriction of legal issues. Furthermore, the movement significantly lowered costs. If equitable access is similarly prioritized pharmaceutically, the industry could reduce development costs since researchers would be saving money from replicating existing research. A 2023 research review corroborates that data sharing and open research could have numerous cost-effective benefits and a potential in addressing disparities among contributors in LMICs. Since LMIC countries can prioritize building upon existing knowledge more efficiently, they can produce far more rapid innovation. From a comprehensive standpoint, global R&D can only be accelerated by reducing IPR when necessary. The second way is rapid production and distribution. Prioritizing equitable access serves to not only foster development, but also enhance production and accelerate distribution, particularly in LMICs. A 2022 systematic review found that stronger pharmaceutical monopolies created by TRIPS plus IP rules are generally associated with increased drug prices and delayed availability. Government support for equitable access may be implemented through compulsory licensing and policies to provide for exceptionally more efficient production and widespread distribution in times of need. Compulsory licensing is a form of government-sanctioned use of copyright materials without the explicit owner permission in exchange for reimbursement to the patent holder. In 2001, a Cipla, an Indian generic drug company, was able to produce triple therapy HIV treatments, which were sold at approximately $350 as opposed to the original $10,000 to $15,000. This price shift occurred after the Indian government issued a compulsory licensing permitting continued production of Cipla. The license also ensured the distribution of the medicine in India and LMICs. As a clear example of the government stepping in to prioritize more accessible treatment by granting compulsory license, Cipla's success resulted from the continued promotion of equitable access. The initiative had a profound success impact on the lives of millions, facilitating widespread treatments of HIV/AIDS and simultaneously reducing production costs. IPR over access slowed vaccination rates from a distribution standpoint, but also hindered vaccination production. The refusal to provide access to vaccination development data resulted in significantly stalled vaccination output, straining a limited number of products in HICs. The WHO, or the World Health Organization, found that addressing global crises is exceedingly difficult without waiving IPR rights and technology transfer. The necessity of prioritization of equitable access is demonstrated through comparison of failures during the pandemic to successfully compulsory license granted during crises such as the HIV epidemic. Ultimately, these policies, paired with IP waiver proposals, saved countless lives and enabled rapid production and distribution to LMICs, as well as high-income countries in times of need. Today, billions face the devastating realities of denied access to life-saving medicines, a fundamental human right. This denial stems directly from the pharmaceutical industry's profit-first model, reinforced by IPR that prioritizes corporate monopolies over global health. Prioritizing equitable access, especially in LMICs, breaks the cycle. By easing restrictive patents, drug prices fall. Governments can purchase more medicine and health outcomes improve. In turn, healthier populations drive economic growth, allowing LMICs to invest in infrastructure and education. Moreover, equitable access encourages international research cooperation, accelerates responses to crises like pandemics. Ultimately, prioritizing equitable access is a moral and economic necessity for global health equity. Thus, we proudly affirm.
Thank you. Opening statement by the negative for a period of 8 minutes. You may begin when ready.
In 1900, the average person could expect to live 32 years. Today, that number has more than doubled to 71. This leap wasn't a product of chance. It was fueled by innovation, protected by intellectual property rights. The shift from trade secrets to patent-backed research in the early 20th century transferred medicine from guesswork into science and saved millions of lives in the process. Thus, we negate the resolution. Equitable access to pharmaceuticals should be prioritized over protecting intellectual property rights. Throughout this debate, intellectual property rights will be referred to as IPR and low and middle income countries as LMICs. TRIPS refers to the World Trade Organization's agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. First are our terms and burdens. Both sides agree that IPR should exist to some extent. Rights are absolute until they infringe on others' rights. Therefore, the affirmative must prove there are no alternate solutions to their harms before justifying an infringement on IPR. Protecting IPR means allowing developers to recoup investments made during product development. We have two levels of proof, both ethical and pragmatic. First, the ethical. The negative is morally justified. The affirmative invites government overreach, allowing it to take intellectual creations with flimsy justification. If original ideas can be seized in the name of vague equity, where does it end? A system that supports creative production, viewing intellectual property as true property, is a prerequisite to progress for all. Asking creative innovators to be a slave to the masses is no different than being a slave to one. The government's role is to protect, not seize, the fruits of innovation. Property rights are essential to freedom and progress. When creators know their ideas are protected, they're empowered to take risks, innovate, and contribute to society. Stemming IP protections forces creators to serve others without recognition or reward. That's not justice, it's exploitation. Real progress comes when governments foster creativity by protecting ownership, not overriding it. Contention 1 is innovation. Patents allow pharmaceutical companies to recover from research and development, referred to as R&D. A patent grants a company the exclusive right to produce, sell, and license a drug for a specific time, preventing competition during that set period of time. Developing drugs involves extensive research, costing billions of dollars and decades of work. Patents allow companies to set prices that reflect these investments. The profits gained from exclusivity incentivizes pharmaceuticals to take risks in R&D. Otherwise, companies avoid the costly, uncertain process of developing new drugs. Models estimate overriding IP protections for 10% of drugs would reduce the number of new drugs per year by 11% by 2050. Any large-scale change of the IP system results in negative health impacts in the long term, outweighing any potential short-term price benefits. This is critical given the future holds the potential for previously unseen medical issues due to climate change and globalization. New medical innovations reduce mortality rates, eradicate infectious diseases, and foster herd immunity. Furthermore, economic growth funds advancements in healthcare. A healthier population is more productive, creating a cycle of economic progress. Additionally, medical advancements fuel the economy by creating high-value jobs and driving demand for skilled professionals. The development of new technologies spurs systemic improvements in terms of cost and efficiency, which decreases prices, allowing for greater accessibility in low and middle-income countries. During COVID, IPR was instrumental in accelerating vaccine development, enabling collaboration between companies like Moderna and Pfizer by letting them license their technologies to partners. This collaboration facilitated swift scaling of production and distribution, ensuring vaccines quickly reached populations worldwide and streamlining the global supply chain. Ultimately, this use of IPR was key to delivering vaccines to millions within only a year of COVID's onset. In a world with weakened IPR, we see a regression away from the practices that have doubled life expectancy, back towards a past strife with lives cut too short. With that, onto our subpoint of trade secrets. Additionally, trade secrets are worse. With weaker IP protections, pharmaceutical companies will resort to trade secrets over patents. This undermines the public scientific collaboration that informs global public health response. Without exclusive rights, pharmaceutical companies would keep product information a secret. The usage of public forums for intellectual dialogue would give way to trade secrets. This type of secretive behavior has nefarious effects for both the scientific community and collaborative principles on which it thrives. Moreover, IP protections encourage companies to take financial risks, confident their innovations would be protected. Without the assurance of IPR, such transformative investments would not have been possible. Contention 2 is counterfeits. Counterfeit medicines significantly worsen global health and the economy. Counterfeits are falsified pharmaceuticals that mimic the original but are inferior in quality, posing a risk to public health and confidence. The WHO has estimated 10.5% of the medications worldwide are counterfeits, which are either subpar or fake, and estimates over 1 million deaths are caused by them annually. However, these numbers are an underestimation due to poor detection. Due to weak regulatory policies on the manufacturing and marketing of medications, counterfeits are generally higher in LMICs. The incidence of counterfeits is around 13.6% in LMICs, and the problem is only getting worse, with an estimated value of $65 and $200 billion every year for the global counterfeit market. The danger of counterfeits becomes evident when looking at overdose deaths. In the US, deaths involving counterfeit pills more than doubled between 2019 and 2021, with more than 10,000 overdose deaths occurring due to counterfeits. The issue of counterfeits can only be solved with increased IP protection. Countries with stronger IP protection provide better means of tracking the supply chain through licensing agreements, enabling greater quality control, and helping manufacturers maintain public confidence in their products. This significantly lowers the chance of counterfeits reaching the market. Next is our counterplan. We propose that governments of the World Trade Organization first adopt a voluntary licensing model. Voluntary licenses are agreements in which IP holders grant manufacturers permission to produce and distribute patented products and LMICs. We propose an implementation of TRIPS-regulated voluntary licensing, in which voluntary licensing is more accessible and originator companies have access to a larger clientele base. These agreements maximize the originator's ability to profit while increasing access by governing production by other manufacturers. Empirically, a voluntary licensing program for tenofovir increased access from 30,000 patients in 2006 to 8.7 million by 2015. Second is development aid. This would be implemented through TRIPS minimum standards with tiered contributions based on a member's country's wealth and tiered aid based on the recipient's level of democracy. According to a Stanford study, countries receiving more aid witnessed a rapid rise in life expectancy and saw measurably larger declines in child mortality. Development aid removes the hierarchical structure of wealthy countries and LMICs. Limiting IPR does not remove the power balance between corporate structures. Limitations of IPR will never be able to solve ethnic conflicts, distribution issues such as having roads. Third is bulk purchasing with public funding. In conditions when prices are higher than the inflation rate in the country or access is low, countries' governments should bulk purchase through tiered pricing. Empirically, the United States has had much success with bulk purchasing for opioids, HIV, and during the COVID pandemic. Additionally, tiered pricing allows for access to LMICs since the drugs will be cheaper without hurting IPR. Fourth is counterfeit regulation. Prioritizing IPR protection leads directly to stronger anti-counterfeiting regulation through legal frameworks like TRIPS amendments, which require member nations to enforce stricter measures. This includes better mechanisms for patent holders to collaborate with enforcement agencies. Additionally, IPR protection incentivizes companies to invest in anti-counterfeit technologies to preserve the benefits of their limited exclusivity.
This time. We will now take a quick break and have 90 seconds of preparation time prior to second speeches. So 90 seconds prep for the affirmative.
All right.
Now, just a second. Get this reset. Okay. Affirmative second speech for 5 minutes.
The affirmative has never argued against innovators protecting their property, and we have never argued that we should take away money from these innovators. Instead, we are highlighting conditions in patent law that have given corporations rights over the individuals, allowing for monopolization for an indefinite period of time, driving up prices thousands of percentages. Now, let's talk about this argument that they're making that we need to provide alternatives. First of all, we'd argue that compulsory licensing, expansion of the TRIPS agreement, and stricter enforcement by the World Trade Organization of exemptions would flow to our case, as what we're arguing for is reducing IP rights, and we'll get more into that later. But first, I want to talk about their economic argument. We are not arguing for a complete removal of IPR. We're arguing that we need to prioritize equitable access. Put simply, investors invest into a company because they believe that returns will be profitable after development is finished. According to Jonathan Gang, these investors provide investment when they see that a company has potential early on. They actually see returns on their investments by the time the product reaches the market. Even if a drug's original inventor is a nonprofit institution, institution or university, they will often still patent any potential treatment they invent. When that patent expires, generic competition is allowed to replicate the drug and enter the market, dropping prices as much as 85%. However, pharmaceutical companies engage in evergreening, allowing them to push off competition by indefinitely extending the duration of their patents, maintaining a monopoly for years. This doesn't create a competitive market. It drives prices up, such as the anti-malarial drug Daraprim, which increased in price from $13.50 per tablet to $750. And high-income pharmaceutical markets are rife with evergreening. Professor Robin Feldman finds 78% of new patents weren't actually new drugs, but existing ones, shortening the exclusivity period, cracking down on evergreening, and prioritizing compulsory licensing doesn't actually interfere with returns on investment. Furthermore, we'd argue that government policies actually offer monetary compensation for things like compulsory licensing, so there's still incentive to develop. Furthermore, data sharing akin to open source means that high R&D costs are lowered. It's more cost-effective when you don't have to repeat past failed clinical trials from other researchers, since you didn't know they failed, since that was a company secret. They say trade secrets are going to happen. That's already happening. That is what patents do right now. They mean that things like basic molecular level research aren't shared, and they have to be repeated, thus contributing to high levels of R&D. Then they talk about COVAX. Don't make it seem like a success. It's an example of how IPR is too strong right now. They claim during COVID-19, IPR resulted in increased access to the vaccine. However, this collaboration was between two different companies, Pfizer and Moderna. But this doesn't actually enable scaled production in LMICs. The reality is very different. COVAX was introduced and the initiative fell short when high-income countries refused to approve an IP waiver due to pharmaceutical lobbying, meaning that this initiative was actually delayed for months and months, while thousands of people in low and middle income countries died per day. On substandard medicines, 2 key points. First of all, if you look at their evidence, it'll actually tell you that substandard medicines are a bigger issue than counterfeit medicines. In Nigeria, counterfeit medicines made up only 16% of confiscated medicine. The actual reason for substandard medicine is supply chain issues and lack of good quality control, citing poor storage conditions rather than no IPR. Secondly, removing IPR doesn't actually solve the problem. According to the World Health Organization, people only turn to substandard medicines when they have a lack of access to affordable medicines. Because in countries like Peru, the monthly price of a patented cancer treatment is about 880 times higher than the daily minimum wage of a worker, requiring 2 years of nonstop work to afford 1 month of treatment. Obviously, even if you know something is a scam, if it offers you the slightest chance of success, you're going to buy it. In the end, the issue is high prices that are caused by these monopolies, not the actual lack of IP. The actual issue is weak regulatory oversight, which can be solved in countries like Nigeria. Finally, on voluntary licensing. They first cite voluntary licensing to show that the status quo protects accessibility. However, it was found that voluntary licenses are just another method of exploitation. They're private contracts allowing companies to hike prices, making access more difficult in the countries they're helping. Additionally, because it's voluntary, companies don't need to do it. And I ask you, when in the past has a country licensed in the last 20 years? We saw Moderna, we saw Pfizer rallying against these initiatives during the COVID pandemic, knowing that they were dooming thousands of innocent people to death. But then we'd also argue that tiered pricing doesn't actually happen. Let me give you the example of orphan drugs. These are drugs treating diseases with less than 200,000 cases in the US. That would be for diseases like malaria, which doesn't really happen in the US, but happens in tropical regions. Despite malaria drugs existing for the last 40 years, there has been no tiered pricing of these drugs because companies want to remain monopolistic. Fundamentally, they're profit-driven. They're not going to do tiered pricing out of the goodness of their hearts. So, Judge, I ask you this. Gamble on a nebulous counterplan that hasn't been implemented despite the last 40 years of patent law, which corporations won't even adhere to, or legally enforce the Doha Amendment, regulate and increase compulsory licensing, and save the thousands of people killed by pharmaceutical practices.
Have a 90-second preparation time period for the negative, followed by the second negative speech. Take a negative speech for 5 minutes. Start when ready.
Compliance does not foster innovation. Trust us. You can't sustain long-term innovation in a world of distrust. Said by Stephen R. Covey. We are going to start this debate with trust. The pharmaceutical companies, we have to trust them that they'll do the right thing. Take them at their best. They will implement voluntary licenses because they want to provide access through the protection of IPR. That is why they joined the industry in the first place. Contrary to what the affirmative wants you to believe in, the pharmaceutical industry is not one of high likelihood of high profits. Now, we'll go on to terms and burdens. The negative wins through proving that equitable access and IPR exist in the same plane to prioritize equitable access over IPR. For example, innovation is necessary, guided by IPR, to increase equitable access. Now, onto our case. First, our ethical justification. Intellectual property as true property is a prerequisite to progress. When creators know their ideas are protected, they're empowered to take risks, innovate, and contribute to society. Next is the pragmatic. Our first contention is innovation. Innovation defines this round as it is a prerequisite to access. The only incentive for medicine to exist in the first place only exists in the negative world, where market exclusivity allows companies to take the risk in creating drugs as they are assured profit, alleviating access problems. We need to maximize those creative innovators more than ever as the world becomes more globalized, the disease comes more and more faster. That means more and more loss at a seismic level. They say they are not fully reducing IPR. Our stat is a 10% reduction in IPR leads to a staggering 11-point reduction in innovation annually. They do not have to eliminate IPR for the worst case scenario to happen. They say that trade secrets happen because of patents, but remember, the life expectancy increased because we have switched from a system of trade secrets that existed before IPR to patented research. The patents means there are no trade secrets now. On the second contention, counterfeits. Counterfeits kill over 1 million people each year, and LMI sees about 13.6% of drugs are fake, with a global counterfeit market worth 65 to 200 billion. Substandard medicines are solved multifold by our plan. First, voluntary licensing ensures that originators can directly work with less developed countries to get them to high-quality drugs. Second, bulk purchasing allows these companies to purchase high-quality drugs at cheaper prices. Third, development aid allows them to create the structures that allow them to develop their own high-quality drugs. Additionally, increased innovation allows for the streamlining of the global supply chain. Next is our counterplan. We propose that the governments of the World Trade Organization first adopt a voluntary licensing model. Voluntary licenses are agreements in which IP holders grant manufacturer permission to produce and distribute patented products in LMICs. We have empirical success in the form of the increased access to both tenofovir and remdesivir during the pandemic. Don't let them say we don't have empirics. They say that companies don't want voluntary licenses, but we tell you that even if companies don't want voluntary licenses, other aspects of the plan solve, like bulk purchasing and development aid. Their own source of Doctors Without Borders advocates for voluntary licenses. Second is development aid, which is not responded to by the affirmative. This would be implemented through TRIPS minimum standards. And third is bulk purchasing with public funding and additionally counterfeit regulation, which would stop those counterfeits in the first place. Now on their plan, on scientific cooperation, this exists in the status quo without oversight. With oversight, when companies file patents, they are required to disclose details of the patented drugs. When you have open access to research without patent regulation, innovation stagnates because companies will choose not to share their research out of fear it is being stolen. Secondly, collaboration doesn't have to be just trust. It only exists under the IP systems framework. The frameworks allow for effective collaboration with companies as they know their drugs are protected. Look to licensing, which fosters cooperation. Now, on compulsory licensing. First, compulsory licensing provides no incentives and causes government rejection, as pharmaceutical companies will always say no since they don't get to decide. This is seen in the example in 1997 when the U.S. pressured South Africa to repeal a TRIPS-compliant amendment. Next, answering their case. According to our terms and burdens, which goes conceded, they cannot disprove the negative plan. On the first contention, evergreening, our opponents misrepresent what evergreening truly is. The idea that innovators extend their patents is a myth and legally impossible. Secondary patents do not extend the patent on the original product. Competitors retain the product's generics. They simply cannot produce an exact copy of the secondary patented product. Even if there are secondary patents, it does not stop the original discovery from being made into a generic drug. Empirically, according to Geneva Network, follow-on innovation plays a critical role in transforming interesting drug candidate into a safe and effective treatment option for patients. Now, on excessive profit. These companies may be making what seems like enormous sums of money. However, this fails to take into account the size of these companies. They have to pay hundreds of employees from people doing the innovation to those market and distribute the drug. Now, onto their second argument. They say that IPR protection reduces collaboration, but the reality is there's no collaboration without IPR. Before IP was protected, we saw the world of trade secrets. There was voluntary licensing is the exact form of collaboration that we need. They cannot solve for their Ethiopia example, as stated by the affirmative. This is an infrastructure problem, which was said. There is no necessity to limit IPR. This can be done through development aid.
Thank you. We will now start with two different cross-examination periods. The first will be between the teams. Captains, will you please be sure that everybody asks a question, everybody answers a question, okay? Everybody on each team, and that way it flows smoother if I'm not having to direct things from here, okay? So let's start with a question from the affirmative to the negative, and we'll see if we can just make this flow without me intervening at all. Go ahead.
So I want to talk about this idea of trust. What I want to point out is that patent reform preventing companies from evergreening and doing monopolistic exploitation actually has bipartisan support, which I'm sure everyone knows is actually a very, very rare occasion in today's legislature. So in the last 40 years of monopolistic behavior, exploitation, evergreening, which has been pointed out by both parties in our government, why should we now start trusting pharmaceutical companies to do the right thing and not prioritize their own profits?
I think the answer, we can't really answer this without establishing what evergreening really is. You try and say that evergreening is an extension of the original patent, but that just by definition is not what evergreening is. To clarify, evergreening is when the original patent expires or in the process of improving the original product, they create secondary patents that involve the improvements on the original drug. This means that this new patent is on the modification, whatever they changed. It is not on the original drug. Once the patent on the original drug expires, that means that generic companies can come in and manufacture that original drug. The issue with evergreening, the issue that would make it a source of company greed, is that these minor modifications are not enough of an improvement to justify another patent. We argue that if it is the case, if these minor modifications are not enough to justify another patent, why can't generic manufacturers just go and generically produce the original patent? If the quality is the same, people will benefit just as much, right? If that's not true, then the alternative is that these minor modifications are significant improvements to people's health when they take them, which means that companies should be rewarded for making this substantial increase in patient health.
Let's have a question from the negative to the affirmative.
Okay, let's talk more about.
I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry.
You guys.
Yes.
Okay. Given that companies need incentive to innovate, when we implement your plan, how does it affect companies and their production?
Our plan is on increasing compulsory licensing, which doesn't actually affect innovation. Because when you think about compulsory licensing, it's just a short ban on your intellectual property rights for a short period of time when there is an actual conflict between access and IPR. When that happens, investors aren't just going to suddenly all pull out of the product that they've been investing in for months. And even so, we've read in rebuttal that investors will invest in public and private investments for drug development if they see anything that will hit the market. Compulsory licensing and the extension of the Doha Declaration doesn't stop innovation because it's not a continuous thing. Compulsory licensing only happens for a short period of time to allow broader access for that global crisis or that crisis that we've been talking about for the whole constructive and rebuttal.
Question from the affirmative to the negative.
Is it okay if I have a follow-up?
Question from the affirmative to the negative.
Okay, so to start with evergreening, you all said that it was the extension of a patent on a product that was slightly modified. So these slight modifications, in most cases, are not significant changes to the actual drug, and they do not improve. So how do we know that with the decreased amount of generic drugs that are currently produced with evergreening, how do we know that that won't happen with your claims about evergreening?
Well, the answer to this is that evergreening is not an extension of a patent. It is a new patent on its own, which means that these minor modifications create a different set of IPR in and of itself. generic companies are still able to create patents or are able to create drugs from the original patent itself. These minor modifications, as we said before, have to be significant, or else why are generic companies not using their resources to make drugs from the first patent?
Negative to the affirmative. Someone who hasn't asked a question yet.
Okay. We want to know, what policy implementations do you actually do? What are the specific lines of things that you'd accomplish through your method?
Yeah, so that's a great question, actually, because we were going to get into that a lot more. Basically, the Doha Agreement was passed around 2000, I believe, in order to set a framework for how countries can interact with each other when it comes to medicine. Then later on, the TRIPS Amendment was the Doha Amendment was passed in order to clarify that they actually passed TRIPS in order to maintain equitable access. And that's through things like compulsory licensing and even through the voluntary agreements that you were talking about yourself, and we'd argue that that's actually a reduction of IPR since you're voluntarily licensing your IP rights away. But overall, what I'm arguing for is a stricter enforcement of the regulations laid out in Doha. The World Trade Organization has the power to enforce these regulations, improving compulsory licensing, decreasing the power of lobbying companies, and even in the US government, that can also be in the form of regulatory action taken to decrease the amount of evergreening, decrease the amount of lobbying, stuff like that.
Question from the affirmative to the negative.
Yeah, let's talk about evergreening again.
Oh, let's talk about evergreening again. You guys tell us that evergreening is just an entirely separate patent, but literally the National Institute of Health, the UC Law of San Francisco all say that evergreening is just a strategy used by pharmaceutical companies to extend different parts of their product. So they make these new modifications, which is like increasing 0.01% of a 0.01% of like an ingredient and saying like, oh, we've changed our product, give us a new extended patent on it, or this part of the patent. This allows for to cover patents on multiple different parts of your product. So how does that matter, and how does that correlate with your definition of evergreening, where it's a different patent when multiple organizations and College of Law and the government all agree that evergreening is just a strategy used to extend patents on the original product in itself?
Has everyone on this side answered a question to this point? I think there should be one more that hasn't. Then it's yours.
Okay. What we are telling you is that it's like the definition of evergreening is that it's a different patent. Sure, like it doesn't, what like those organizations you're talking about is saying is that's basically what they're saying. Like it's a different patent. There's no like correlation between like the two. I'm not sure if I understand.
Can I expand?
Question from the affirmative to the negative.
I would just like to, from affirmative to negative.
Yeah.
Okay, I would just like to clarify on evergreening what you just said. You were talking about how it's a small modification to the drug itself. However, if you look into evergreening a little bit more, you'll see that it's also on delivery methods and dosage. So that has no effect that still restricts generic drugs from entering the market because they can't produce the drug for a lower cost. So how do you say that evergreening would not, how would you say?
Not the same.
Yeah.
So delivery and dosage method specifically is actually a really good example of why evergreening is a positive thing. Evergreening, by definition, is new patents. We have established that. So the reason that they patent these delivery methods is because by delivery methods, what they mean is the rate of ingestion into the body. When we take in drugs, we excrete them, that's known, and what these companies do is when they originally create the drug, they want it to be potent, but they do not focus on the absorption rate of the drug initially. So once the patent has been established, there are further improvements made to it in areas like this. They absorb it into the body faster, meaning that patients get more benefits from the drug when they take it. I feel like they are underestimating how much R&D goes into it. Developing pharmaceuticals, even when you have the standard drug and you're improving on it, it takes a lot of money and a lot of work. This is required to recoup. Why would we see investments of pharmaceuticals if they do not get money back for the improvements made?
Okay. Question going the other way? Everybody's asked and answered, so whoever has a question.
I have a question. You want stricter regulations on the TRIPS amendments, yes? On compulsory licensing. However, how does that solve for the problem that you've already addressed, that high-income countries don't want to do don't want to do compulsory licensing because it creates restrictions on IPR. You have to follow this specific drug price. You have to license for this specific amount of time, which is why voluntary licensing is better, because we can create structures of how the license works. Why does just increasing protection solve for those issues?
Okay, so first of all, thank you for agreeing that high-income countries don't inherently want to give lower-income countries drugs. But secondly, I would argue that that's why it's called compulsory licensing, because the World Trade Agreement is the World Trade Organization is the organization that enforces TRIPS, enforces Doha. With stricter regulation, the World Trade Organization actually does have power to control the economic stability, the economic conditions of these countries, and they have the power to punish countries that do not agree with compulsory licensing, which is key because there's really no punishment for evading it right now. We saw that in the COVID pandemic when the US just got away with not giving lower income countries any money or any vaccinations.
That's the end of the questioning period. Thank you, both teams. Very well done. We will now have a cross-examination period with our panel. I'll stay out of this as much as I can, but let's try to direct questions to the entire panel. And let's do this. On each team, nobody can answer a question a second time until everybody on the team has answered a question. How's that? That's the easy way to do this. So, panel, they're all yours.
I'll go first. Who here has a younger sibling? Can you please tell us what this debate is about in as simple terms as you possibly can, and then also state why the other side's position fails and yours prevails?
Have a preference for which team goes first?
You could go first.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you. Okay, so let's look at our neg case. We have 3 points of contention, yes. First is our ethical justification. Think about it this way. Would you make one person a slave to the masses to justify serving the few? This is what we say. We are going to steal from these creators based on some explanation that they owe it to people, that they have to benefit them, even though they're already putting their hard work and money into creating this drug that saves millions of lives. That's our first contention. Next, let's go to innovation. Innovation comes first before everything else in this round. Without innovation, we have no drugs. No lives are saved. The only way to see innovation is through the protection of intellectual property rights. This is proven by the fact that before intellectual property rights, we did not see patents, which meant that effectively every drug was going unregulated with no quality control. And 2, we saw trade secrets. There was no collaboration because companies couldn't trust each other to just steal research from each other and claim it as their own. Then let's go on to counterfeits. If we do not have IP, if we do not protect intellectual property rights, this means that criminals will take drugs, they'll dilute them, they'll make changes, and then they'll sell them pretending that it is the original drug. This is what counterfeiters do. It's like if somebody had a Coke bottle and you have a nearly identical Coke bottle, but the O is an A. To the consumer who's looking at it at first glance, they cannot tell the difference. They unknowingly ingest the fake version, which could propose so many dangers to them. Who knows what is in that? We say that IP protections is the only way to protect the supply chain to ensure that this does not happen and people are consuming the safe versions of the drug that these companies are trying to sell to the world.
Good
the
place
ones
to
that they have
stop right
spent.
there.
All right, my sister is 8. I'll try my best. All right, so big companies want to make money. This is known. They need to make money because that's what companies do. That's why they do this thing called evergreening. Evergreening is where you extend your patent on a product for as long as you can. And that's on the original product, according to many smart people, law professors, big schools, the government. So when evergreening happens, that can be something as simple as putting a new plastic strap on an asthma inhaler. I personally don't think that's fair because that's not a new product. You just have a new plastic strap that really doesn't do that much. And honestly, in around 80% of cases, that's what companies do. Rather than making a new development like the dosage thing that they're talking about, it's just something very simple, a 0.01% adaptation. That's why prices are so high. That's why we saw a drug go from like $1 in cost to $500. That's because companies want money. But then we can talk about global health crises and scientific cooperation too. Right now, we know researchers are unwilling to share. They say that there's trade secrets, and that was before patents, but actually, researchers aren't sharing right now either. That's why we have to reproduce early clinical trial. We have to do new trial on molecular agents because we simply don't have that public information. But if we did have that public information, it would be like in the early days of the tech sector, in the open source movement, when everyone was sharing like the basic building blocks of code so you don't have to repeat easy stuff. But then we tell you that it'll also improve production and distribution, which is basically where the pharmaceuticals, with voluntary licensing, we can have things like limited, lower or middle income countries can actually afford to buy in bulk. They say that we should buy in bulk, but if we are spending this much money on drugs, we won't be able to invest in infrastructure, which means we won't be able to actually give people the medicine because they can't come to hospitals, and those aren't really as good as they should be.
Let's stop right there. Next question from the panel.
I have a question to follow up on this evergreening. You give this example of an asthma drug. And the difference, they have the patent, it's about to expire, so they create the asthma drug with a strap for distribution, they get a patent for that. Now they've pointed out, but the original patent has expired. You pointed out that the strap doesn't do much. So couldn't companies just say, fine, we will produce the asthma drug without the strap? It's not protected by patent, it's just as effective as it always was. So you're arguing that evergreening has this very negative effect. But by your own admission, the second patent is kind of pointless because I could just make the thing without the strap. I'm not violating IPR. So where's the benefit?
Even if it is just based on that strap that we're talking about, that small improvement, it's still a patent on the entire original product, meaning companies cannot reproduce any part of that original product, including the strap. So they just added on a small piece of basically the patent, the original patent. So the entire thing still cannot be entirely replicated, which is why generic drugs would be delayed to reach the market.
So essentially what it is that you have your original product or drug, and they make like this addition where the strap is added, and it doesn't really do much. But the old patent expires. This new patent, however, includes the strap and the old drug formula, which means that generic companies can't replicate the old drug or the old innovation because it's a part of the new patent that includes the useless strap, which is how they extend patents on their products.
You want to ask the negative about that, or did you get the answer you were looking for?
That was the answer.
Okay. Question?
Yeah, it's kind of a two-part question. First, for the AF. So does evergreening have anything to do with compulsory licensing? Are these independent parts of your advocacy?
Yes.
So we're having two different debates about evergreening and then compulsory
Yeah, they're two different
licensing.
topics.
Okay. All right. I did not expect you to say that. So negative team. So like, are you gonna it sounds like you're policy debaters. Are you gonna perm their advocacy for evergreening? Like, are you okay with disallowing the plastic strap? Like, if that's not legitimate IPR, like, are you okay with the government banning that? Or are you defending, let's say there is at least one example of this like abusive evergreening. Do you think that should be protected because of your strong views on, property rights?
Okay, so we can break this down. First, I don't know if it's perming, but instead, we agree that there are regulations right now that protect pharmaceutical companies from evergreening. This is why these cases, they continuously tell us that all of these articles are saying that evergreening is bad. However, they can't point us to a specific example. Secondly, we have multiple situations where this is not true. According to Geneva Network, follow-on innovation plays a critical role in transforming an interesting drug candidate into a safe and effective treatment option for patients. A good example of this is AZT, a drug ironically described as the guidelines as the first breakthrough in AIDS therapy. AZT began its life as a failed attempt at a cancer drug, and it was only years later that its potential application in fight against AIDS was realized. So there was a difference which was needed to repatent. We give you specific empirical evidence of why evergreening is not true. They continuously just make this claim.
Okay, so I want to give you all a chance then to talk a little bit more because I just had a quick question for you originally. But my question is, what's your legal regime on alternative? Are you banning all follow-up patents? How do you distinguish evergreening from legitimate drug development, like this example, or maybe this is a bad example? You can dispute it if you want. So like, what is your actual advocacy?
All right, so there's actually a legal term for this called frivolous patents. And what a frivolous patent is just evergreening, but without significant changes. So obviously we're not,
Frivolous patents are already, you can already sue someone for that, right?
but the problem is that there's no regulation of it in the US. And that's
So
just why it keeps going
It's
on.
a
That's why-
regulatory change.
That's why evergreening keeps going on. And we need to reform the patent law against that.
Actually, could you describe that a bit more? How would you reform the law?
I believe that there's actually a lot of bills for it being passed right now. It's to look at if there's actually a significant change in the drug, if there's a significant change in efficacy, and compared to the current existing amount of evergreening, which is honestly the majority of extended patents, right? And if we look at it from a logical standpoint, think about what companies want to do. Companies want to make money. They want to make money by preventing generic drug competition. So if that's the case, then why would they continue evergreening if generic drug competitors could just enter? Like, why would they continue doing a failing method, right? But the truth of the matter is that generic drug companies can't enter the market when there is evergreening. That's why companies continue to evergreen. And insofar as they can see that evergreening is a thing, well, it must be effective, right?
Let's put evergreening aside for a second. You have a 3-point counter plan. Voluntary license, development aid, and public purchasing with tiered pricing. Now let's assume, for the sake of argument, one of you or all three of you are the leaders of a lower middle income country. And you don't have a lot of money. But no company's willing to give you a voluntary license. USAID just went out of business, so you're not getting development aid anymore. And the company says, no tiered pricing, this is our price, take it or leave it. So now you have a choice. You could just not get the drug, or you could take the factory that you got money from USAID to build before it went out of business and say, okay, they won't license it. We don't have any money to buy it from you from the government, and you're not going to give us a lower price. So we're going to take the patent, which, as you point out, tells me exactly how to make this drug so I can make it safely because it tells me exactly how to make it. I didn't get the voluntary, I didn't get the aid, I didn't get lower prices. I'm just going to make this drug so my people don't die. How is that leader wrong? What is that leader doing incorrectly?
So first of all, we argued that the development we propose would be through TRIPS. So it would be part of the minimum standards agreement. Members of TRIPS would pay in based on their development level, and then based on a government's level of advocacy for protecting intellectual property rights and democracy, they would receive aid. So it wouldn't be from USAID, it would be as part of TRIPS.
But all of this is voluntary,
yes.
right?
No,
So what if
TRIPS minimum standards means to enter TRIPS, you have to follow it.
These are as they're talking about.
So wait, are you arguing that these regulations, which by your definition are not voluntary now, are
So,
limiting IPR, correct?
The reason why this is promoting IPR is because we increase intellectual property protection in these less developed countries that currently do not have a system, because the aid will go to countries who protect intellectual property.
But how is voluntary licensing voluntary if you're saying it's
This
obligatory?
is separate. This is separate.
Okay. I'm
This is
confused.
development aid. Here, I can lay it out. Voluntary aid is by companies. So that's separate. Voluntary licensing is directly like giving them the ability to produce. Development aid is allowing them to build the infrastructure to produce. Just like you were talking about, countries should be able to produce generic versions of the drug.
Okay, but how is that topical? Like, that has nothing to do with IP. Why can't they also say, yeah, okay, let's give them money?
As the negative, we don't have a responsibility to be
No, I
topical
understand.
on
I
the
understand
counterpoint.
that, but like that.
That
That,
proves our
that,
point.
that that's a plan that you have. That's great.
Yes.
It's a good idea, but it doesn't appear to contradict the resolution unless you can explain to me how it offsets with IPR.
You're exactly right. It doesn't contradict the resolution. We are the negative. We are to prove that IPR is not in conflict with equitable access. So by giving other solutions, we prove that we do not have to limit IPR in any form to be able to give equitable access.
Okay, let's try something else. On the pro, right? You've argued, hey, look, counterfeit, the problem with counterfeiting is really just that factory that we built over there in that mythical or makeup. They're just crappy at making the drugs, right? It's not that they're violating IPR, it's just that they're not very good drug manufacturers. Well, then how are you solving for the problem by releasing IPR? If all these countries are just bad at producing drugs, telling them go ahead and produce them, here's the patent, you could just go to the patent office in Washington, they'll tell you how to make it, but they don't know how to make it. They're just bad at it. They don't have good quality. So how are you solving for anything by releasing IPR if the problem of counterfeit and quality is just bad manufacturing?
So I would say that that's more of like a waterfall effect. So two of our contentions, one of them was on improved infrastructure when you alleviate some IPR.
Economic benefits that help with economic development.
When you
How
spend
does
less money on
releasing IPR build a better factory?
when you spend less money on drugs, you can spend more money on infrastructure. And honestly, that's what their buy in bulk thing is saying, right? Because if you have to spend, say, 4% of your GDP just buying this medicine because it's so expensive, then you're not spending that on infrastructure. And then because of that, you can't produce better drugs in the first place.
And also, IPR, we've demonstrated that it induces price gouging. So when you have access to a cheap drug and you don't have to spend the money to produce that drug, like you were saying, they don't have the voluntary licensing, they disagree. They don't have the ability to reproduce the drug, so they turn to, I'm just gonna make the drug based off of what you say. They don't have the they don't have the ability to do those clinical trials because they don't have the infrastructure yet. So they don't have the ability to make safe drugs, and they can't purchase cheap drugs. So they turn to counterfeits, but if drugs were made cheap and affordable, they wouldn't have to turn to these counterfeits.
And drugs are only made cheap and affordable if IPR is reduced, because when you get rid of evergreening and all of these like strategies that pharmaceutical companies use to extend their patents, then generic drugs are going to be on the market a lot faster and a lot more effectively.
Thank you.
Ms. Gudura, you stated that's not justice, it's exploitation. Do you recall saying that? What did you mean by that?
Yeah, so what we are saying is that when we like reduce IPR, when we get rid of these patents, we're basically saying that these creators have to share their products or their ideas, and they don't get to own their own ideas and their property, right? And they the other side might argue that's good, but we're telling you that it's it's unethical because they are the people that are coming up with these ideas. We make the analogy that it's almost like being a slave to everybody because you're not able to use your own ideas. You're doing it for other people.
And question to DuPont Manuel, do you agree that justice is good and exploitation is bad? And if so, do you agree with what Ms. Gudura just said?
Of course, justice is good, but I think you'll find that the side that prioritizes justice is the affirmative. We're not hurting the individual innovators. We're not taking away funding from the Nikola Teslas who might, make the next great invention. What we're doing is we're stopping pharmaceutical titans who evergreen. And that's not completely taking away IPR. Obviously, we still need competition in the market. We still need people to want to innovate. What we're arguing for is that we want to stop indefinite extension. We need to reduce the long exclusivity periods that drive prices up. And we need to especially do compulsory licensing in cases where there are conflicts. Because of that, I believe we can have the best of both worlds, where we can have the pharmaceutical companies still innovating, and we can have equitable access.
Also, not to mention the affirmative resolution and tactics are only in place when there's a direct conflict between IPR and access. And you see a lot of these undermined and hidden issues in LMICs with small epidemics that countries that innovate and produce their drugs for, like the US, don't actually give them the access to these medicines at a cheap and affordable price. The US doesn't need like malaria medicine, but LMICs do. But they still hike prices and they don't give them at a cost, and they still evergreen and patent for these malaria medicines. Therefore,
have
on the
ti-
affirmative side, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Okay. Therefore, on the affirmative side, we are prioritizing justice and access. We're not getting rid of IPR. We're just making sure that IPR doesn't come before access.
Thank you. I think we probably have time for one more question to the negative, if somebody has one.
I do. You argue that we should trust the drug companies. Now, there's a great America, or depending on your point of view, a president that when I was alive, Ronald Reagan, who said, we'll trust, but we need to verify. When it comes to drug companies, how do we verify? A lot of what you've said is voluntary. Well, what's the role of the government, or how do we verify that drug companies are not being exploitative? How do we do that?
Well, in the status quo, before you can attain a patent, it has to be FDA approved. So that ensures quality control for these pharmaceutical companies.
No, but that's, once they have the IPR, you're saying trust them, that they're not going, because remember you said that patents were there so you could recover your investment, not gouge.
Yes.
You said patents are supposed to be for a limited time, but they're saying they're going to try and extend it indefinitely. So, do we trust the companies to just give them the IPR and then let them go with it? Or, like the pro is arguing, affirmative is arguing, maybe we have to verify that they are in fact acting with IPR in the public interest.
Real quick.
Well,
Go ahead.
yeah, okay. So, well, you don't have to trust them. We've seen it happen. When we've seen with compulsory licensing, companies resist and they pressure trips into getting them out of it, versus with voluntary licensing, we have remdesivir and tenofovir have empirically been voluntary licensing has occurred, and we've seen exponential increases in access. So you don't have to trust, it exists.
Final speeches by both sides. We'll start with the negative for 5 minutes. And let me get this set up real quick.
Do we get 90 seconds?
Nope.
No? Okay.
Rebuttal speech by the negative for 5 minutes.
Judges, I want you to remember our terms and burdens where we say there should be no infringement on IPR if we are able to solve their disadvantages without eliminating or reducing intellectual property rights. It is unethical to make creative innovators be a slave to the masses. This has been conceded. They have no responses to this. Without innovation, there are no drugs. There are no lives being saved. The only way companies will make new drugs is if they know they will be able to profit. Without patents, companies will have no incentive to make new drugs. This is crucial because no new drugs is especially dangerous given that climate change and globalization is increasing the chance for new diseases. They say that innovation still happens in their world, but remember, we tell you that a 10% reduction in IP reduced new drug innovation by 11% annually. This means that innovation is exponentially decreased in their world. This round can be broken down into 3 main points of contention. Whose plan truly increases access to LMICs and through what methods? And then they talk about all these limitations such as compulsory licensing, however, that doesn't solve for evergreening. We'll expand on this. 2, what really is evergreening and should it exist? Let's talk about this. They say that it's an extension of a patent. However, if you actually know what evergreening is, you cannot extend a patent. That's legally impossible. They say that it's strategic because what they do is they make minor modifications and that becomes a new patent. And they literally are saying it's helpful. They say so many innovators say this, but can't answer our simple question of why this is not true. Innovation is good. They can't solve for evergreening. Frivolous patents are already regulated in this world. They are literally passing bills now as they talk about. The idea that they're extending their patents is false. Even if there are secondary patents, it doesn't stop the original discovery from being generically produced. You should be believing this. And we have empiric evidence of secondary patents being crucial to treatment, seen in the AIDS drug that we talked about during Cross. Then let's move on to number 3. Who ensures a safer world? Let's look at the plan first. They propose compulsory licensing. Let's break down why this won't work. There is a reason why compulsory licensing is not currently used on a widespread level, even though it's part of TRIPS. One, companies get out of it. They use TRIPS to manipulate it to get out of it because they want to choose the terms on which it happens. A study analyzing 30 compulsory licensing cases found prices exceeded median international procurement levels in 63% of instances. Local manufacturing in low-income countries frequently underperform compared to importing generics. Compulsory licensing provides no incentives, and thus it won't work. Voluntary licensing solve much better. Voluntary licenses are agreements in which IP holders grant manufacturers permission to produce and distribute patented products in less developed countries. We have empirical success in the form of increased access to both tenofovir and remdesivir during the pandemic. While we see in these instances with compulsory licensing, it doesn't happen. They are not actually increasing access. Companies are doing voluntary licensing. They are licensing their products, and it is increasing access. We give you examples. You should be believing us. Additionally, they have incentive because they gain more clientele and get to decide it on their own terms. They expand their market and thus are able to increase their profit. Now let's look at evergreening and innovation. Evergreening is a practice where brand name pharmaceutical companies invent new innovations that are modifications. That is the definition of evergreening. Innovation defines this round as it is a prerequisite to access. The only incentive for medicine to exist in the first place only exists in the negative world, where market exclusivity allows companies to take the risk in creating drugs, alleviating access problems. They say, we've talked to you about trade secrets. This is what happens when we reduce IPR and we say open research. Companies will get scared, they will retreat, they will hold their information close to their chest. We saw that IP regulation during COVID was the only reason why we saw collaboration between these companies, because they trusted each other to not steal the information from each other through this IP framework. Now, on to counterfeits. This truly defines who creates a safer world. Counterfeits kill over 1 million people each year, and this is mostly concentrated in less developed countries. They have no way to ensure safety in our world, while regulating counterfeits is only possible through IP protection because we work with supply chain management, we work with enforcement agencies through IP structures to ensure that counterfeits do not enter countries, they do not leave countries, and we capture them within countries. The negative is winning through proving that equitable access and IPR exist in the same plane. To prioritize equitable access over IPR, innovation is necessary, guided by IPR to increase equitable access. We have better access to equitable access in the world, thus you should be believing the negative.
Affirmative. Final rebuttal speech. Period of 5 minutes. You may begin.
The round is over. The side that prioritizes human life is us. The winner of this round must prove that reducing IPR in times of need will help in both the short term and the long term. When you reduce IPRs for medicines that are critical for public health, you increase access to medicine almost immediately. We saw this with the vaccination rates immediately after COVAX was implemented, but we need more of this. COVAX took months and months to pass because of the pharma companies lobbying, resulting in delayed and disproportionate treatment, not the improvements claimed by the negative. Remember, the term prioritized in the context of the resolution does not call for the complete elimination of IPR in the pharmaceutical industry. We still want to keep patents, we just want verification. Access is justice. This isn't about hurting the individual innovators. This is about pharmaceutical titans who evergreen. Remember, we aren't arguing to completely take away IPR. We actually still want patents in place. We're just arguing to prevent indefinite extension and reduce exclusivity periods. They want to prioritize the company over the individual. The entire negatives case relies on trusting pharmaceuticals to do the right thing, which we haven't seen happen ever. In the history of the pharmaceutical industry, companies have even lobbied against, meaning paid for, extended exclusion of access during COVID, a global pandemic. Pharmaceutical companies are inherently profit-driven and have proven themselves to be untrustworthy. Both teams agree that the elimination of IPR is not good and not debated under the resolution. However, the negative claims that the compulsory licensing already exists, but the affirmative would like to point out that compulsory licensing takes months and months to implement because pharmaceutical companies lobby against them to keep prices and choose profit over humanity. That's why COVID took months to fix. They fundamentally misunderstand how compulsory licensing works. They think that these are forever and they will continuously reduce innovation. However, they make a dire misunderstanding, confusing compulsory licensing for the proposed voluntary licensing approach. Voluntary licensing, not compulsory licensing, relies on the goodwill and trust in big companies, which has been agreed upon by both teams, is unreliable because companies don't want to give drugs LMICs for cheap. Companies inherently do not want to provide access to their patented inventions, which demonstrate the need for compulsory licensing over the proposed counterplan of strictly voluntary license implementation, as opposed to the inclusion of compulsory licensing and more strictly enforced regulations of the TRIPS and Doha Amendment. Voluntary licensing already failed during COVID when Pfizer and Moderna lobbied against giving LMICs vaccines. It took months while thousands of people died every day. They say compulsory licensing doesn't happen right now. That's exactly why we need to affirm, because it's not being enforced right now, and we can enforce TRIPS and Doha only through improved access. The World Trade Organization has the power to do it, and it will do it upon affirming. Finally, let's talk about the evergreening argument. Remember, companies are smart and profit-driven. They have hundreds of lawyers telling them what to do. If evergreening was not successful at delaying generic competition, then pharma companies wouldn't do it. The reality of the matter is, generic competition reduces prices by 85%, and stopping them allows companies to drive up prices by thousands and thousands of dollars. We have given every possible way of explaining the concept of evergreening. These modifications are a majority of the time irrelevant to the efficacy of the drug. Rather than responding, the negation refuses to accept the reality of the pharmaceutical industry. Their counterplan that hasn't been implemented despite 40 years of patent law, which corporations won't even adhere to. You're gambling on a plan that hasn't worked and probably will never work. Instead, you can legally enforce the Doha Amendment, regulate and increase compulsory licensing. They tell you there would be counterfeits. Remember that people only turn to counterfeits when they can't afford regular drugs. Substandard drugs are a separate issue that can be solved with better infrastructure, which only happens when we help countries access cheaper drugs so that they don't spend all their money on medicine. Now, going back to our case, this is where you're going to be voting. Pharma companies have exorbitant prices, rendering treatments unaffordable for many low-income families and LMICs. They use strategies like evergreening and patent thickets to exploit prices and prevent local manufacturers and LMICs from producing affordable alternatives of generic drugs. By addressing IP restrictions, LMICs could save significant amounts of money that would have been previously spent on drug costs, allowing reinvestment into healthcare systems and critical infrastructure. This not only addresses the issue of counterfeit drugs, as explained during judge questioning, allows decrease dependency of LMICs on high-income countries. Remember, investors invest because of patents. It's great that they agree, but because we're not taking patents away, we told you that investors invest as long as they believe a product will hit the market because it's much easier for them to recoup costs. That doesn't change in the affirmative. But most importantly, decreasing IPR drastically increases scientific cooperation through open source and allows for more collaboration between researchers across nations, which is undisputed. We're not arguing for removing all IPR or even exclusivity periods, just that we need to prioritize equitable access. By the framework set by the negation, they had to disprove the efficacy of our approaches in alleviating the current issues with IPR. They have not, and thus cannot win this round. Ultimately, the logic in which the negative argues is the reason for why healthcare inequality and inequity is a persisting issue. Prioritizing the profits of billion-dollar pharmaceutical companies over millions of lives perpetuates the disproportionate system we live in. Access is justice, and vote for justice.
To our teams, a big thank you to our judges and our moderator. We are now going to give the judges an opportunity to cast their ballots, and we will announce the team that will be moving on to the finals shortly.